incorporate Torah into our lives. Again, this may take a little while, so if you want to sit down and take a load off, you can, because it's a bit of a sermon here. So if we were living in biblical times, and there was one year that included floods, wildfires, earthquakes, and a pandemic, followed by a massive number of people leaving their homeland, having to leave where they were from, we might call them today the largest refugee crisis in history. Back then in the Bible, we would have referred to it as the exodus of the Jewish people from Egypt and the birth of a nation. Today, we just call it 2020. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that any of our leaders today are of the same caliber as Moses. And I'm not suggesting that God is sending the United States in particular a message about its priorities and how we must realign them as we pray every Shabbos morning. May it be your will that our land be a blessing to all who dwell on earth. And may you cause all people to dwell in peace and friendship. I'm not suggesting that I am a skilled prophet at interpreting events, and I wish I could persuade people of the direct cause and effect of our relationship with our world, and that it's just that simple an equation. And even if I did, I'm not quite sure you would believe it, and I'm not quite sure I would believe it either. My theology doesn't permit it. And as the rabbis pointed out in the tractate of Sanhedrin, Misha metu hanevi'im ha'achronim Chagai, Zechariah, Malachi, nistalka hanevuah Yisrael. That from the days of Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, prophecy is over. We don't have prophecy like we did back in those days. And you know, as I always say, there are two jobs that everybody in this congregation wants me to do, but I'm sorely unqualified for, and that is to be a judge or a prophet. I don't know any better what's right or wrong than you do, and I certainly can't predict the future. But that doesn't mean that we all can't see patterns as they unfold in our lives. And depending on how we choose to see those patterns and events gives us a sense of meaning and purpose. And this is an important and, we can disagree about the patterns and what they mean. But the patterns that we see speak to what we are all about. They speak more to what we think than what's actually going on in the world. It speaks to what we're looking for, and it speaks to what we have decided to focus upon in our lives. Therefore, today I ask the simple question, what events in our lives have we overlooked? Which events have we overplayed? Do we focus on our failures, or do we focus on our accomplishments? And then why? Why do we choose to obsess over those moments? Do we focus on the joyful celebrations or the grief and the loss? And why? Why do we choose one over the other? Last week, I spoke of the people who influenced our lives, the role models, the teachers, the saviors, and the angels. Now, I speak of the moments. In this week's Parsha, we see how the events of Joseph's life have shaped him. After being thrown in a pit, sold from one group of people to another, fighting off the advances of Potiphar's wife, ending up in a dungeon, going to meet a butler and a baker. He begins to see how little control he has over his own life. The only thing left is that he learns the lessons of those events, learn the lesson of the meaning and the purpose of what it means to come in service of others. Humility is the lesson Joseph is learning over the course of his life. So when he's presented with the opportunity to redeem himself at the hands of Pharaoh for a life of serving, His behavior is to respond with humility. Vayan Yosef et Paro lemor biladai Elohim ya'anet shalom Paro. Joseph answered Pharaoh, as the cantor has already chanted for us, it's not me. God is the one who will see to Pharaoh's welfare. It's not me. It has nothing to do with me, says Joseph. It's all in God's hands. And Rashi explains that the words biladai are really just two words, bal adai, meaning that Joseph was just a witness to the events. And that's what's important for us in our lives to understand today. And that is, what are we witness to? What are the events that are important that we will tell our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren, please God, that we were able to see in our lifetime? What were those events that shaped society as we saw them, as we witnessed them? I'm not suggesting that Joseph was the first to point to the heavens after he sunk a three-pointer and ran down the court for a blocked shot. I'm not suggesting that Joseph was the first person who, after completing a touchdown, as so many athletes do today, point to God and say, it was in your hands. But maybe we could give at least a little credit where credit's due. One of my favorite pop philosophers and comedian and social commentaries, a guy named Tim Minchin, was giving a commencement address at a university, and he said the following: "You are lucky to be here," in addressing those who were graduating. "You are incalculably lucky to be born, and incredibly lucky to be brought up by a nice family that helped you get educated, encouraged you to go off to college. Or if you were born into a horrible family, that's unlucky and you have my sympathy, but you're still lucky. Lucky that you happen to be made of the sort of DNA that made the sort of brain which, when placed in a horrible childhood environment, would make decisions that meant you ended up eventually graduating from college. Well done for dragging yourself up by the shoelaces. But remember, you were lucky. You didn't create the bit of you that dragged you up. They're not even your own shoelaces. I suppose I worked hard to achieve whatever dubious achievements I've achieved, but I didn't make the bit of me that works hard any more than I made the bit of me that ate too many burgers instead of going to lectures when I was in college. Understanding that that you can't truly take credit for your successes, nor truly blame others for their failures, will humble you and make you more compassionate. You have to remember that you are who you are because God made you that way. My father used to say to me all the time, what you are is God's gift to you. What you make of yourself is your gift to God. Understanding that you truly can't take full credit for your successes, and you truly can't blame others for their failures, will make you more compassionate. The Ber Chaim, Rabbi Chaim of Chernovich, compares Moses to Joseph. And he says that the events of Moses' interaction with Pharaoh were in so many ways the same as the interactions between Joseph and Pharaoh. It's a step that later we'll see such great symmetry when Moses takes Joseph's bones out of Egypt, as if to say they're so similar. They're made of the same stuff. Mayim Chaim tells us, doesn't this story in some way remind you of the time Moses goes to Pharaoh to get him to see the one true powerful God? To teach him that God is in charge. Just as Chaim Gano used to say about parenting, we spend so much time teaching our children something they already know, and that's we're in charge. Rabbi Chaim of Chernovich goes on further and he says that we can't alter nature. Ki hakol mitnaheg acharei hateva levad. Ve'olam kiminhago noheg. God has set the world into motion. God is in charge. Moses pleads with Pharaoh to understand he's not the Almighty. Joseph pleads with Pharaoh to see who's sending him the message. There's no question that in our day and age we have found a way in some locations to overcome nature. In some ways we have even been able to predict the weather. Sometimes we have figured out ways to circumvent the tide of massive loss of life that would be considered an act of nature. This week, again, we witnessed a vaccine come to market that has the ability to destroy a disease that has already taken more than 300,000 lives in America alone. And that same pandemic have robbed so many of the livelihood, resulting in loss of homes and basic needs for sustainability. You recall other moments in American history. Some of us witnessed other moments in American history when disease like polio was cured with a vaccine. But there is another event that occurred this past week, and that was the Electoral College met and submitted their votes in accordance with the great American experiment in democracy. It has done it this year as it's done every 4 years. As Americans decide for ourselves what our path forward is going to be, we come together and we assert our abilities and our desires for the future we want. Benjamin Ginsberg said, it's a cosmic convergence. And so I began to think to myself, is there a pattern? Then Dr. David Oshinsky, he's the professor of medicine at New York University's Lang Hong Health, and a historian who wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning account of the development of the polio vaccine that had eliminated that scourge in the 20th century, remarked, I honestly can't recall two independent events of such extreme importance occurring on the exact same day. But it was his last sentence that struck me so deeply. He wrote, in our bitterly divided country, December 14th, 2020 should remind us of who we are and what we are capable of. The awesome ability of Americans to find our way out, to find a path towards a better life, the ability to rise to the occasion and do what's needed. Just want to say as an aside, Michael Dolston, who's the chief scientific officer at Pfizer, happens to be Jewish. That's not the message. The message is that we're partners with God. That's why challah and wine are what transform our regular meal into a holy occasion. These are two food items that come into being because of a partnership with God. We say the phrase, Hamotzi lechem mina aretz. Thank you, God, for bringing forth bread from the ground. But we don't for a second believe that bread grows from the ground. Wheat grows from the ground. We have to do something with it to make it into bread. God does God's part by growing the wheat. We do our part by transforming that wheat into bread. And by saying the bracha, Hamotzi lechem mina aretz, we're giving credit to where credit is due. That's why I say with at least some trepidation, we need to heed the lessons of this past year, lessons of the value of community in the face of social isolation, the value of what we have when so many are going without so much, the value of our own health when so many are suffering and struggling just to breathe. Last week I spoke of the people who influenced our lives, the bullies and the saviors, the toxic and the angels. Now I speak of the moments. I can't tell you why some focus on the negative and others focus on the triumphs. That's a sermon for another time. Rather, today I can ask you to look at how do you understand the events of your life. Today, I beg of you to think through which events call out for more attention and which have we already overemphasized. Well, I stand by my opening statement that from the passing of the later prophets of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, prophecy has ended. I still believe God is talking to us. Once had a circumstance of a mother who brought her young little boy to see me. As he waited outside my office, his mother and I had a chance to talk. She told me she was very concerned. Her son says God is talking to him, and she wanted me to have a chat with him about this crazy notion that God could be talking to him. So I brought the kid in, and while the mother stared at me, waiting to hear what I was going to say to him, I asked, "So what's going on? Your mom told me you think God is talking to you." To which he said matter-of-factly, "Yes. Every night after I say the Shema, I go to bed, and God talks to me." He was so nonplussed by this, I didn't know how to respond at first. He was so sure. And who was I to say that God wasn't talking to him? So I glanced over at the mother. She gave me a look of, "Go on, tell him that's crazy talk." So I turned to the boy and I said, "Well, keep listening. See, God is talking to us. I don't have a corner on the market of what God's trying to tell us, but I do have to tell you, you got to keep listening." Shabbat Shalom. So, Cantor, I think we can bring this